beautiful winter day here in the heart of central Vermont, and we're at the base of Camel's Hump. And we're about to do a hike up from the Monroe Trail entrance to Dean Trail and over to Wind Gap, and we're going to visit Wind Gap Pond. If you've hiked before on Camel's Hump, if you've gone up this Monroe Trail, and you've also done the Forest City Trail or the Burroughs Trail, you know that this southeast side of the mountain looks really different than the other side. Both forests are beautiful, but there are things written into the trees on this side of the mountain that we're going to explore. And some of those events include logging and fire and replanting and regrowth. And so there's a story of change here at Camel's Hump on this side of the mountain that's recorded, and that is also the story of Vermont. Last time that I was up at Wind Gap Pond, well, the very first time actually that I was up there, it was a beautiful open pond that looked almost like a pristine alpine glacial pond. But we're going to discover there's a story of change up there too. So, come with me and we'll have a good hike. We've left the parking lot and we're starting to get out of all the dog tracks and the near civilization signs of life and wildlife. And we're here where wild animals are starting to show up. And one of the things I noticed right away with this trail is just how purposefully this animal is moving through the landscape. Dogs are well fed, they're exuberant to be outside, and they run all over the place, and they're kind of sloppy in their movement. But animals like foxes and deer and coyote and bobcats, they're out looking for a meal. As we hike up the trail, we're going to gain elevation. And before we leave the forest that we're in right now, I just want to introduce a couple of the trees. And one of my favorite trees is the yellow birch. And this is a lovely specimen. It doesn't have the same kind of peeling bark as a paper birch, but it does peel. And in the golden light in the late hours of the day, it's a really, really beautiful color. I think finding colorful things in winter is one of the reasons I like to go out. And I will say that its cousin, Betula papyrifera cordifolia, it used to be called, now it's become its own species, Betula cordifolia. It's the higher elevation heartleaf paper birch. We're going to go find that, and there's a story about that tree that I want to tell you. I've been starting to notice these husks in the snow from the beech trees that we're coming up on. And I remember this beech tree. I was on this trail one fall, and we came down below this tree, and it was the forest floor was covered with these beech nuts, and they were ripe and delicious. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. The beech tree itself is in pretty ideal conditions here. It's large, it's straight grown, it's doing well. And beech and the yellow birch that we saw, sugar maples, they do really well in lower elevations. We're going to gain about 1,000 feet in elevation as we head up to Wind Gap Pond, and we go through a transition zone from these lower forests into the higher altitude forests. And we will find a beech tree up there, but it's really bonsai'd. I want to show it to you because it's one of the highest elevation beeches I've ever seen. It's at 2,300 feet up there. So meanwhile, the nuts, to tell you the rest of that story, were scattered on the forest floor. I know that they're nutritious because I've read that for wildlife. And I can see a lot of mice tracks around here where they may be out still looking for leftover beech nuts, or they may have cached them to get through the winter. But we ate them, and I can tell you personally that I know they're delicious. They are sweet, sort of a cross between maybe an almond and a pecan. It's hard to find them because the wildlife eat them so readily, but if you ever get a chance to try one, I highly encourage it. They come in little triangular nutlets, like 3 of them inside these husks, and keep an eye out when you're out in the fall for beech nuts. We're starting to come into the heartleaf paper birch. We've gotten up to an elevation where they start to be a component of the forest. And it's not unusual to see them here. I mean, this is their their home. This is where they do well. I want to tell you one of the ways to tell them apart from paper birch that's at lower elevation. These heartleaf paper birch have this lovely inner bark that's salmon colored and beautiful. And I have sort of two different shades of it in my hands. And this I found on the ground. I didn't peel it from the tree. So beautiful bark, and in the summertime it does have heart-shaped leaves. So it's cordifolia, heart-shaped leaves, and heart-leafed. This bark, it has interesting properties. People are pretty sure that the bark is light-colored so that as the day warms up and the inner part of the tree warms, that when the sun goes down, it doesn't quickly, it is already sort of, it reflects that light back, so it doesn't get really hot during the day and then cool down quickly at night, because that tends to create cracks in a tree. So they think it's adaptive in that way. And traditionally it was used to make canoes. So the funny story is that over in the Adirondacks, someone made a movie, and they had the person make a birch bark canoe with the white part showing. So that's become kind of the stereotype, that these birch bark canoes had the white part on the outer side, but actually they're permeable. You know, moisture can go through the bark this way. The waterproof side is the inner bark, which keeps the moisture from escaping. So if you took a canoe that was white on the outside and put it in the water, eventually it fills with water, it gets saturated and it sinks. The traditional way of making them by the native people was to have the inner bark on the outside, so they were waterproof. But they never really fixed that. The boat makers on the Adirondacks, this is the story anyway, they were happy to make these canoes that sank after a couple of years, because then they would make people another one. So it became kind of a craft to take advantage of what was initially sort of a mistaken idea, and just carry it forward. So anyway, lovely, lovely tree. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about patterns in this tree as we go further up the trail. One of the things I love about winter is these ephemeral things that happen, like these little mouse tracks. We can see probably a white-footed or deer mouse have hopped along here. You see its tail drag in the snow, and then it disappeared down this hole for a little while and then came out later. Or it went down and then back out and up again. Often in winter conditions, there's what's called a subnivean zone. The snow sublimates. It turns into vapor at the base and comes up and refreezes, and you get a crust, and then you get really a pocket of either looser snow or air that these small animals can live in. And it gives them added protection in the winter. They're protected, from predators not being able to see them. They have to either hear them or smell them. And they also are protected from wind. And the temperature at ground level under a snowpack of 6 inches or more stays right around 32 degrees. So it's not freezing like it can be on the surface of the snow. So also, when I go hiking in the winter, one of the challenges is to adapt to the conditions and how fast you're moving. And I've certainly learned over the years how to layer and also take off those layers as I warm up. All leading up to this hike today, I was watching the weather and I was thinking, please don't be zero, please don't be zero. And then a few days ago, it was predicting rain. So these kinds of dramatic changes can happen over a few days' time in the weather forecast, but also you can change temperature through moving up the mountain. So I think about the animals that live out here and how they have adapted, and I try to learn from them about how to be in the woods in winter. But there's so much beauty out here this time of year. It's worth figuring out how to be comfortable so that we can get out in it. We've made it about a mile up the trail to the juncture of the Monroe Trail with the Dean Trail, and we're going to catch the Dean Trail over toward Wind Gap. We're going to be heading, more or less west and across the brook. And we also are going to pause here for a minute and consider the forest that we're standing in, because there's something really interesting going on here with the heartleaf paper birch. So it's not surprising to see heartleaf paper birch up here on Camel's Hump, but what's surprising is how dominant it is on this side of the mountain. If you go to the other side, where if you came up Forest City Trail or Burroughs Trail, you'd be hiking at this elevation, you'd be hiking through spruce and fir. And that would be a more common dominant set of species. And that's where Hub Vogelman did his acid rain research. Those two trees will comb moisture out of the fog, and you can test it for acidity. So he did some pivotal research on acid rain and helped have the Clean Air Act established so that some of those acidic chemicals were scrubbed out of the smoke that came out of Western factories. So anyway, the story here, though, is we don't have them dominating this forest. And the reason is that in 1903, there was a giant crown fire on this side of Camel's Hump. And the thing that helped set the stage for that was in 1859, the Forest Mills Lumber Company was established on the other side of Camel's Hump, but they came in here and they cut down the spruce and fir. And then there was a lot of slash on the ground in that summer of 1903. It was a hot, dry summer. There were fires here, there were fires in the Adirondacks, but the fire here burned 2,000 acres. And in that waste well, it wasn't a wasteland, but it reset the clock on the forest here. And the heartleaf paper birch seeds rained down onto this landscape. They blow really far, they're small, they're winged, and they got established, and they became the canopy forest here on this side of the mountain. So we've made it up to Wind Gap, and the name comes from the fact that there's a gap between two ridges, Camel's Hump and the one south of it, where the wind just whistles through. So we're hearing the wind now, we're feeling it, but I'm excited to be here, and I'm very excited because I have a surprise for you. Some of you will remember that Kathryn Wrigley and I made a film this summer at the base of Camel's Hump, along Camel's Hump View Trail. We promised each other we'd meet up here in the winter. And Kathryn's here, so let's go find out what she has to share with us. Kathryn.
Oh, hey,
hello.
Alicia.
Hey, we're here.
Woo-hoo!
We said we'd come, and here we are. Nice to see you, darling.
Good to see you too. I was just taking
So-
in this space. It's so different from the last time I've been here.
Yeah, I'm not always up here in the winter, and it does look very different. One thing I noticed right away is we're not in that heartleaf paper birch anymore. We're in this ring of conifers.
Yeah.
And there are two things I notice about them. One is that they're kind of marching into what used to be Wind Gap Pond. So they're sort of starting to encroach on this wet meadow,
Totally.
which is an old beaver pond. And when I first started coming out here, you could still see the heartleaf paper birch stumps
Oh,
in
really?
among the shorter spruce and fir.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
And another thing that's changed in the 30 years that I've been coming here is now the Norway spruce are overtopping everything, so they really stand out.
Yeah, I haven't been coming here that long, but I also noticed
That they've gotten tall. They're
Yeah.
starting to obscure the view. And those Norway spruce have a different story. We know there was the fire in 1903. Then there was some replanting after that.
Yep.
They tried first planting pine, which didn't naturally like it up here and didn't succeed very well. And so they just tried later with Norway spruce, and here they are today.
They seem to be thriving.
They do well in this climate. So let's look around a little bit. And I think, did you bring some timelines with you?
I did. Can you see them?
I do
They're right
see
in my
them.
backpack.
All right, we'll take a look at those.
Awesome. It's that type of snow where when you step in the wrong spot, you lose your leg.
So what did you bring us?
Oh yeah, hold on, let me just swing my pack off.
And just to remind people, Kathryn, can you tell people again what you do?
Oh,
and
sure.
What brings you to Camel's Hump a lot?
Yeah, I'm Kathryn Wrigley. I'm a forest recreation specialist out of the Essex Junction office for the State of Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. And yeah, I just get to help manage recreation on state lands in Northwest Vermont, which luckily for me includes Camel's Hump.
One of my favorite spots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I brought two things today, and then I didn't know if we could do both or one or the other.
Well, let's try them. Let's see what they are. They're little handmade timelines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite windy
It
in
is.
this wind
Can
gap.
Can you roll that in for me while I...
Oh, there's a dinosaur.
Yeah. All right. Maybe we don't need to start all the way back in the Iapetus Ocean, but we'll just know that these rocks formed underwater. Let's go past the dinosaur. And we'll go past that. We'll go past the glaciers.
See you later, glaciers.
Yeah, let's start here.
It's been too cold to talk about glaciers.
Because we're really going to talk about people.
Yeah.
So what happened in 1798? What is it?
Great. In 1798, Ira Allen names Camel's Rump on a map of Vermont. That's right. I said Camel's Rump.
Rump. Originally it was rump.
Yeah.
Yeah. This guy had a sense of humor.
And around that, a little later than that, but around that time, people were hunting beaver quite a bit, and so by 1850 they'd actually been extirpated from Vermont.
So there were no beavers.
No beavers left, which I know if you live today,
it's hard to believe.
It's hard to believe because they're everywhere. And then in the 1880s there was a lot of logging, which is sort of a known story across New England, and it occurred here even on Camel's Hump. So there's extensive logging, a lot of trees were removed, and a lot of forest now is considered like second generation forest. And then we get to the 1900s, and up here on Camel's Hump, there was actually a fire.
In 1903.
In 1903, which is hard to see here today, but Alicia, there are ways that we can explore and find signs of that fire.
Absolutely. I read one study where they looked in tip-ups.
Oh, really?
And they found charcoal in the soil in every one of them.
That's
so
amazing.
There's still charcoal hanging around from that fire.
Yeah.
So you told me in 1911.
Yeah. So then this is in Camel's Hump. We're currently standing in Camel's Hump State Park. And so that was originally started to be established in 1911 when Joseph Patel donated approximately 1,200 acres to the state of Vermont to start the formation of Camel's Hump State Park, which is now upwards of 20,000 acres, which is probably later on the timeline. So sorry about that spoiler.
Also, I forgot to say that the fire burned like 2,000 acres on this side of the mountain, a ton.
A lot, especially at this where it's like high elevation and quite steep.
Yes. Yep.
And yeah, they were curious to know too, like what to do with. There was a question around salvage logging too after it.
Right. So then there was replanting, and we saw the Norway spruce in the overstory.
Yep, that's what's currently blocking our view of Camel's Hump.
And then beavers were reintroduced.
1921.
Into Vermont, but not in here. But we know they got here. And there's some evidence that they got here in the 60s. So it took them a while to get established here. But when they got here, there was a lot of youngish paper birch, heartleaf paper birch for them to eat. So they were very happy.
So they were super content.
Yep.
I used to live up here in 2008 and could still see the beaver pond that they...
Yes, the pond
was still here.
So they dammed it and kept it here.
And then in 1944, there was a plane crash on the sort of, not the summit, but on the side of Camel's Hump due to bad, poor weather conditions. And you can actually still see a wing of that plane crash if you're on the Alpine Trail coming down from the summit.
Oh, that's cool.
And there's a really nice plaque at the Monroe Trailhead around it. And then this is kind of on the other side, but in the 1950s, acid rain or acid deposition was a big deal.
And this was the research I was telling people that Hub Vogelman did.
Exactly.
Looking at the composition of the fog, really,
Yeah.
that was...
And it was affecting the
Yeah.
growth of the spruce.
Yes.
And those plots still exist today, and they were actually just re-monitored last summer by scientists at UVM. So it's pretty
Wow.
cool to see how the longevity of
And the other thing was
those
the
plots.
upshot of this research was the Clean Air Act.
Yes.
And the fact that they started to scrub these factories out in the Midwest so
Yeah.
that it wasn't flowing here as easily. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
we get some nicer, cleaner rain, I suppose you could say now.
So we think the beavers arrived, they chewed down the birch, they built their dams.
Go figure. So busy.
Yeah. Well, let's, and then there was an ice storm, 1988, that you can still see signs of up here. And then in 2008, there was still a pond.
Yeah, see? This
Yep.
is the pond.
Yep. So let's look at this other one real quick because it has some photos, I
Oh,
think.
yeah,
you told
that's
me.
why I brought it.
Okay.
All right, Alicia.
So Kathryn, here's another student timeline. I wish I could credit each of these students by name, but it was a group project. But here's another one that has a lot of photos. So they indicate the pre-settlement forest. Here's the establishment of Forest Mill Lumber Company in 1859. What do you start to see in the photos?
What I love about this is it's showing some photos of old structures that were pretty high on the mountain, which is just not something that we would ever, build today. And so, and as we noted before, people cut quite a few trees. So in 1891, Camel's Hump was almost completely denuded of trees as we know them today. And Joseph Patel actually purchased the remaining forest. And so this is sort of, we didn't catch this in the other timeline, but this shows us why he then in 1911 is able to donate it to the state.
And so he bought it before the fire.
Yep.
Yep. And then the fire just decimated the remaining trees, mostly. And there...
So this says 1905, but
It should
it should say 1911.
Okay.
And
These people
then
really
in
like their
1908, the Camel's Hump Club forms. And check it out. They love their buildings. So this is another Camel's Hump club. And I'm assuming that this is one of 3 of the tin huts that they built near the summit.
So it says that they tried to plant pine. We talked about that briefly, and that did not work.
I do like that they included a deer.
Chewing on him.
Yeah.
And then they planted over 300,000 Norway spruce.
And it's pretty cool. They show, this was a huge undertaking. So this is actually a photo of the camp that the crew who was out here planting all of those was living in.
Wow.
And as Alicia pointed out the horses earlier, and I think, does this look like a car to you?
It might
Or a
be
cart? It's a cart.
Maybe a
Oh,
cart.
by an ox.
An ox cart bringing up the seedlings, maybe, and stuff.
And now we're getting into 1916, and so in 1910 the Green Mountain Club forms, which is the club that's responsible for the Long Trail. And so in Will Monroe, who also donated a portion of his land later, Will Monroe cut the Long Trail south from the Camel's Hump summit to the planting camp at Wind Gap.
Wow.
So it's pretty cool to think that people were already trying to figure out how to maximize access to this really cool resource. This is just some more pictures of the planting. This is another example of an old lodge. You can see it's a three wall shelter.
Yep.
And then Montclair Glen Lodge was built in 1918. These are often called Buchanan lodges because Buchanan and Monroe were 2 professors at UVM who were really involved in the club, and the Buchanan lodges all have this log style because when they were originally built, they probably just took trees from the locations.
Right.
In this picture, this is from a more recent upgrade, and these logs were flown in by helicopter.
Okay. Wow.
Sorry, that's a lot of information about that. And then in 1933, the CCC begins forest improvement in Vermont, and you can see this is the Camel's Hump Camp, which is pretty cool to think about all the work that group of people did. And then in 1969, the forest preserve was created. And by 1991, Camel's Hump State Park, which Patel, you know, seeded with his 1,200 acres. Anyways, it's up to about 20,000 acres, and it's at a similar acreage today. And it's just one of the only undeveloped peaks that's this high in Vermont. So
That's awesome.
I'm always really glad to be able to share the like histories of
The area.
this area.
And it was funny watching just two different groups of people do two very different timelines.
Yeah.
There's a lot to feature.
Totally.
Yeah.
Exactly. You can definitely dig into any one story quite a bit.
So I have a surprise for you.
What?
I've
Is it a
invited-
muffin?
Oh, next time.
Just kidding.
I did bring some chocolate for later.
Yes.
Remind me. Let me not forget that. But we've invited a couple of trackers
Oh, really?
to come up and meet with us.
That's cool, because on my way up here, I saw a lot of little tracks.
It's been beautiful conditions for them.
Yeah.
So I want to introduce Sophia Mazowita and Dave Muska. Hi, Sophie. Nice to see you, darling. Oh, we've been up here before, huh?
Been a
Hey,
while,
Nice to
though.
see you, Dave.
Hi, Kathryn.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank
and you
you
know
for having me.
Catherine.
Hello.
Yeah.
Great
so,
to meet you guys.
so would you, Sophie, just remind me what hats you're wearing right now? You're doing tracking.
Lots of different
Yeah.
hats. Yes, I'm Sophia Mazowita of Tracking Connection. I run a wildlife tracking program with a nonprofit called Hollow to Canada, and also with Tracker Certification North America, which is a professional association and certification body for wildlife trackers.
Woo!
Yeah.
I'm so happy. And Dave, I've met you through North Branch. I've been on some lovely tracking days with you. One of them recently that was quite cold,
Yeah,
but beautiful, beautiful tracks that we could see toes and claws and
yeah, incredible
pads and
tracking.
stuff. Yeah, but what hats do you wear these
Yeah.
days?
So I'm a naturalist and educator at North Branch Nature Center, and also I run a small business, Andatre Adventures, and through that business I teach naturalist courses in tracking and wild mushroom identification, as well as guide trips. So opportunities for people to get outside and build relationships with nature.
Thank you, thank
Yeah.
you. I have a question for you too. This occurred to me this morning, and you can weigh in on this too, Catherine.
yeah.
But I wondered if you dressed everyone in t-shirts and blue jeans, and you had a room full of birders, and you had a room full of trackers, and you had a room full of botanists, and a room full of geologists. Without talking to them, could you walk into that room and find your people? Like, could you find the room your people were in, do you think? Can you identify trackers?
Maybe you'd walk in with
Well-
like fox pee in your.
I smell fox
Is this like
pee.
is this an indoor room, or is there outdoor stimuli? to cue you into?
I think the outdoor would identify them quickly, but if they
Yeah.
were inside, do you think you'd know your people?
Interesting.
I have something to say about it. You know, I notice people's awareness.
Yeah.
And, you know, when I'm with trackers like Sophie and other folks who spend time outdoors really looking at details, I notice their awareness going off the trail into different locations. Even in conversation, like, or moving through an area, I'll watch people's eyes glance across a series of tracks or patterns, and that might be a clue.
Okay.
If we were all outside wearing jeans and t-shirts. Indoors it might be hard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair
Although,
enough.
some trackers I know they'd be like looking maybe at like the corners of the ceiling, like looking for spider signs.
True, true.
Looking at like where the tread and the carpeting is, where people have been walking across the room. So yeah,
Got it.
you
Got
can
it.
track in an indoor setting.
Good to know. Well, we're outdoors and we're in a beautiful place, so we just thought we'd spend some time up here and see what we find today. We haven't had snow for a few days, and it's coming. But we arrived here when maybe the tracks have shown up, so let's see what we see. Huh?
Cool.
All right.
Wow. Look at that.
It's a straight up wolf track right there.
I know. Like, it's a great study in what conditions would allow for an animal that large to make a print like that on the snow
And not break through the crust.
and not break through.
Yeah, because it's so funny. Like people look for certain things in tracks, and so often you don't find all of those classic features. So like what I see in this track here are 4 toes and a triangular, palm or heel pad, which is really the metatarsal or metacarpal pad. That's about the same size as maybe 2 of the toes. which is something that we see for dogs or canine tracks, whereas like for a cat, the pads are usually much bigger in relation to the size of the toes and the track overall. There's enough negative space that you can draw an X through it that basically cuts off each side toe from that pad, and then the center two toes. So those are all good canine characteristics. There's also something missing though that people often associate with canine tracks, which is really clear claw marks. And I can see actually at the ends of the toes where those claws are in these dog tracks, but it's not super obvious. So that's often what makes tracking so much fun, right? That you get all these different snow conditions, all these different looks at tracks, and you can see a bunch of features that support one possibility. And then, you know, there's sometimes something that doesn't fit or maybe makes you question another. But yeah, just really beautiful how lightly, like this seems to me like a track that was put down on a cold day. And this seems like a fairly heavy animal if I just look at the splay of the toes and the size of the track, and yet it managed to stay up on the crest.
Wow.
And actually, I can put a good amount of weight down myself and not break through this crest, so I think we've got some pretty strong wind crest here. Actually, probably freeze melt crest is what's happening here too, right? So a combination of that, but really, yeah, because I can, whoop, there it is.
Yeah.
It took a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a new kind of track.
I take it this way?
Might as well follow this snowshoe trail, right?
So one of the animals we'd expect to find out here is the snowshoe hare. It's like one of the nicest environments for these guys. And one of the things we can look for, you know, in tracking, we're looking for a lot of different features. We can look for tracks, like we saw with the dog. We can look for sign, like browse. And we can also look for things like urine or scent marking or scat. And right here, we have some rabbit scat or lagomorph snowshoe hare scat. So first thing we're noticing with the snowshoe hare scat, and this is also the same for cottontail and lagomorph scat, they tend to be rounder and a little bit skittle shaped, so to speak. We'll also find other scat in the forest that might be a little confusing when we're thinking about snowshoe hare, and porcupine scat can be akin to this, but they'll be a little longer, less round. And deer scat kind of look like raisinets, and of course have an entirely different texture most of the time. Of course, what the animals are feeding on really depends on the time of year and what food is available. So between cottontail rabbits and snowshoe hare, some of the habitat characteristics that are different are, I would say, the elevation, temperature, and we know with snowshoe hare they actually change their fur color, and it's in timing with the amount of daylight that's available through the year. So they'll begin to change from a brown color in the autumn into a white phase, and then back again in the spring.
This low conifer growth, I tend to think of snowshoe hare as being up in that spruce fir zone, right? So when I look at especially young conifer growth where they can access the buds and young branches of these trees to feed on, or you know, the bark of young saplings, it just looks like perfect rabbitat to me. That's what I like to call it, like conifers that you have to pretty much swim through, right? And then I start dreaming of lynx as well, although I'm not expecting to find lynx up here on Camel's Hump. I can hope and dream.
Someday maybe.
Yeah.
With the availability of hare would come their predators, lynx, bobcat, fisher.
So, sort of jumping off on your point that we're among conifers, on our hike up we spent a lot of time in hardwood forests, but we know that there was some paper birch here, and the beavers cut it out when they built the pond. So they accelerated the succession on this site. They released these trees that were growing up under them. And I saw in one study that the growth rings of these trees became a lot wider from 1960 to 1980. You know, and they just shot up in the overstory. Yeah. So this conifer ring has been influenced by beavers, and it helped create perhaps these more of these younger trees for the snowshoe hare. It's all interesting how things link up, isn't it?
It's all connected.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, this is the turkey trail. It was like right up this way.
This is where you found the turkey?
Yeah, so I came out here like 5-6 winters ago, and it was a winter where we had no snow cover in Burlington, so I came up to Camel's Hump and up to elevation looking to do some snow tracking, right? And there's lots of different things that you can do when you track, but my goal that day was to get on the trail, ideally of a carnivore, right? I was thinking maybe I'll find a coyote, or maybe a moose if I'm really lucky, maybe a fox or a fisher. And I thought that along this talus slope here would be a great spot to look. It just feels like a natural corridor in here. And on my way up the trail, I stopped for a lunch break, and a wild turkey came out onto the trail in front of me and laid down a beautiful fresh set of tracks. And so I thought, well, here's a trail. I gave the bird a few minutes to get ahead of me, and then eventually they're going to take me to that carnivore trail that I want to be on, or I'll find something else, But that's often my practice when I'm out trailing or tracking in winter, is just to follow the tracks, read the behavior until I find a trail I'm even more interested in. And so this turkey came in here, and it was great. He brought me right into this area that I wanted to explore. And we got to this location here at the base of the slope, and he just started heading up into the birch trees. And so I'm following along, and just like, steady pace, this turkey's just trekking along, and this bird's long gone. I gave him just a few minutes, but nowhere to be found. And if you look up that slope, I mean, there's the long trail up there, right?
Yeah.
Like this turkey wanted to get to the long trail, so I guess, because he just is going up and up and up and up, and you can kind of see where like the snow is perched on the cliff ledges there. Basically got to a point where in order to follow this turkey, who never broke stride, I was climbing on birches, and I got to the point where I was balancing on top of a birch tree that was growing like this out of the slope, and I had this sheer 8-foot drop of an ice wall below me, and I thought, this is kind of crazy.
I think so, yeah.
Tracking alone, so intent on staying on the trail. And so the turkey just totally beat me. I couldn't actually keep pace, and these are fairly heavy birds. I was surprised.
I don't think of them as mountain climbers, but
Yeah.
maybe I'm wrong.
I was surprised to even see them up here in the first place. But I even found a nice little pile of turkey scat there, and all signs that this bird had actually stayed on the ground and just maintained that pace. Wow. So they've taken up ice climbing here.
This is a nice little find.
This is remarkable, just the difference in quality here, where they're sinking in and then on top of the snow for a couple beats.
So Sophie, I was really surprised to find this tree up here at this elevation. Dave, do you see them at 2,300 feet very often?
No, this is pretty rare.
Yeah, and look how gnarled it is. I mean, it's just putting on little bits of growth each year, but you can see the classic cigar-shaped beech buds, and I mean, it's an American beech.
I'm not seeing any claw marks on this beech, but I'm really drawn to looking for them, right? Because beaches are such a magnet for bears and for other wildlife, and this being the lone one up here, you kind of wonder who's drawn into it.
Exactly, and it doesn't have the energy to reproduce. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not seeing the husks on the ground, but I hope it can create food for animals.
Right. So right now, many of the animals that we see are crepuscular, meaning that they're out and about at the dawn and dusk times, most actively. So the animals that are about ready to start moving around again are certainly aware that there's a big storm coming. And I don't know, I imagine perhaps some of them will be trying to fill their bellies, because we've got about 11 inches of snow coming, I think, somewhere around
Maybe
there.
more up here.
Maybe a little more up here. So the animals are tuned into what's happening. They're aware. So I suspect tonight will be a busy night of feeding and hunting. And then they'll be bedded down for the coming couple of days while the snow is really difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we're really fortunate to be up here today after, about 5 days without fresh snowfall. So we're seeing a lot of days worth of activity here right now. Whereas if we come up, well, obviously during the snowstorm, we're not going to see much if it's actively snowing, and then in the couple of days after, as you just said. Yeah. I also just like to think about, where is this fox now? There's so many questions you could ask when you're tracking, but I always think about how this trail connects to that animal, and also picturing a red fox, curled up in a little ball on top of the snow, right? Because they just bed down right on top of the snow cover, you know, maybe find a place that's protected from the wind. But that's where they could be right now, right? Waiting for dusk to fall and to come out and do some hunting before hunkering down for the snowstorm.
Yeah. And to that end, those animals are curled up in a ball on the snow as the snowstorm is happening,
Yeah.
right? So they're being buried and insulated by the snow until they're ready to move again. And so many animals do that. And of course, ruffed grouse seek refuge in the snow.
They go down in it.
They dive down, and
Yeah.
they'll, of course, sit in one spot and wait until the time is right to move again.
Gosh, it's such a pretty view
Wow.
through the trees.
So this, yeah, this is a really fun part of tracking. You know, we're looking at the snow, right? Looking for animal tracks,
Right.
but there's tracks and sign everywhere. And if we look at this old paper birch, look at this bark and look at the patterns on the bark, we can see these marks, kind of like scratches all across it. And even up here, these are marks from some animal
Climb.
climbing, moving up, right, up the tree. And we could put this story together deeper and deeper the more time we spend with it and start thinking about the animals that might be here, that might be going up a tree, that might have, you know, the width of, you know, a foot that wide kind of thing. 4 toes.
Four.
Maybe there's a 5th in there somewhere,
Yeah.
registering. Anything to add, Sophie? Observations?
Those are all good questions. Yeah, I'm noticing about the same thing. I always like you said, right, picturing the foot size, right? Like what size foot might have made that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, are the toes spreading out and grasping the tree, or are they tighter together?
Even if it seems wild and crazy, like, you know, would a raccoon do this? Like,
Right.
okay, no,
Yeah.
it's like, it looks too small, but like, let's just think about that.
Right.
And then as I try to come up with like my top 3 or narrow the list, squirrel is definitely up there. And I think about red squirrel, I think about northern and possibly southern flying squirrels here.
Right.
And then I think our list of options runs out.
Mm-hmm.
With the squirrels.
Yeah.
Chipmunks.
Yeah,
Based on
chipmunk.
that size.
Yeah, chipmunk, not at this time of year,
Yeah,
but yeah,
yeah.
that's not necessarily recent.
And these
time.
are too small for this, but fisher
Yes.
is another animal that
Yes.
comes to mind.
Yes.
Mhm.
And
And-
porcupine.
And porcupine.
I mean,
right?
what, when you
Martin,
think of tree
yeah.
climbers.
Martin.
Yeah.
And if we follow, if we follow fisher tracks, if we have the opportunity, we'll see they go everywhere. They,
Yes.
you know, do these wild circuits under logs, over logs, and up trees and into
And
hollows,
sometimes,
looking for
like
food.
I saw one set of tracks with a tracker named Mike Kessler. It looked like it bounced off a tree and hit another tree. You know, it was like
Yeah.
ricocheting and then
Mhm.
landed down in the snow.
Yeah, you're reminding me. Just the other day, I was following a fisher trail, and it was using birch trees. It was jumping up onto birch trees and leaping off of them. I don't know how high it went up in the tree, but at some point it came off the tree, and it leaped out, and where it landed in the snow, it left the entire body impression, including the length of the tail.
Yeah.
So you could get like, I saw like a nice shape of the animal, the
So
width
like a
and everything.
Fisher angel.
Yes,
you know,
totally. A
right?
fisher angel, and then back into the lope, into the forest.
Beetle galleries, these sort of larval patterns that
Mm-hmm.
these bark beetle type beetles leave. And apparently
Right.
they're unique to each species, so you can figure out what species of beetle it is when you look at the pattern that the larvae leave in the wood.
Yeah, so one thing that I've been looking for as we're hiking up through all of this hobblebush here, which is this beautiful viburnum species with these naked buds. So like, you know, here are next year's leaves with this like fine powdery coating that's coming off on my finger. Moose just love to browse on this. Or, you know, you see it a lot. I don't know what's going through a moose's head when it finds hobblebush, when they find some hobblebush. But I've been looking for sign of recent browse, and one thing to look for when deer, moose, or ungulates, right, members of the deer family, are browsing is a really ragged edge. And I'm just looking to see if I can find any that really show, you know, like a more recent cut or that kind of raggedy edge. But what's going on here is that if you've ever seen a moose smile or a deer smile, they only have lower incisors, they don't have top teeth. And so they'll come along and they basically use their lips against those lower incisors to pull off the buds or pull off that part of the branch that they're feeding on. And it's almost like, you know, pulling it across like the lower teeth as if they're like a saw or like a tape dispenser. I like to think of like a tape dispenser and like coming off and cutting. So just coming along and grabbing those tips. And so it tends to leave that kind of jaggedy, like a piece of tape that you've just cut, kind of edge to it. Which just isn't quite clear here because of how old this is. But it's definitely not like a clean 45-degree angle that I'd look for if, say, a snowshoe hare was feeding on this, or if a squirrel had clipped it, or any member of the rodent family. And also just knowing who's likely to be eating what is the other clue.
Wow.
Those
Nice.
are dainty.
Those are nice looking little tracks.
See this one here? You want to get really good, you can measure, right? And this track is clear enough that I could measure it. So if I wasn't sure who this was, I might pop out my little ruler and say that the length is just over 2 inches. Width is about 1.5 inches, and then compare that to field guides and other resources. But that's within range for fox. Well, just looking at this though, actually, this is a great example of a trail that's snowed in, so we don't have really any details of the tracks. If these tracks are more recent and maybe there was like light fluffy snow within them, we could maybe blow out the tracks. You can even melt out bits of snow in the track to try to get down to the track impression. So here we are thinking like, is deer a possibility? Is coyote a possibility? Yeah. Domestic dog? And one clue that I really like in this set of tracks here is that I see this as a fairly wide trail, 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 footprints. This looks like a walking pattern based on the width, and imagining that this animal could be balanced on these 3 feet and just moving one at a time. And that gives me a rough approximation of the animal's hip to shoulder distance, like their body size, right? Because they might have these 2 front feet down and a hind foot down here as this hind foot is moving to displace the front there. So balanced on these tracks, so that's them, hip to shoulder. And so that gives us an approximation of the body size. So like, for example, I know I don't need to tell you this, Dave, but this isn't a fox, right? Like that's too big a track to be a fox.
Yeah, this is big. This is a big grouping, look at that.
Yeah, so
Even a little further.
So definitely in that coyote deer territory. Yeah, oftentimes when we think about using that size trick, it's like having 1, 2, 3 feet down, so it's about hip to shoulder, but usually there's a bit of an extension, yeah, so you bring that size in just a little bit.
Yeah.
Another thing to consider, right, there's 1,000 questions, 1,000 observations we can make in this set of tracks, and so just considering what is the movement, right? Is this animal walking? As its baseline, is it walking more than anything else? Is it trotting, in which case I'd expect a narrower line of tracks, and that's moving 2 limbs at once? Is it doing something else? Am I seeing like clusters of tracks and then airtime, implying more speed? So that could help narrow things down too. And I am wondering about the possibility of a domestic animal as well in the mix. I definitely wouldn't throw that out because we are close to ski trails and human activity. But
yeah, looking along this trail, something I'm also noticing is where the animal is moving, and in relationship to branches that it would either go over or under. And that might give us a sense of how tall this animal is. And if we can look at the track pattern and see it continues walking underneath those, or near those branches, we could assume that it's perhaps shorter than those branches. So it'll give us an idea of an overall height of the animal as well.
At this point, I'm suspecting that this is a canine. I'm open to some disagreement or debate on that, but I'm suspecting a canine, like a coyote or a dog, and seeing that foot length there.
Right.
And heading in this direction. So being able to take in that full foot length. And so coyotes, all members of the dog family actually walk up on their toes, right? They're digitigrade. We consider them digitigrade walkers, right?
Yep.
Like they walk essentially on their toes and like the front. It's kind of like the equivalent of like the front of the palm of our hand or the ball of our foot plus toes. So it's only in these deep snow conditions or certain substrate conditions that we actually see the full length of the foot here. And so like we could actually take this measurement and try to hone in on who it is just based on that foot length, if nothing else.
Yeah, and something to get a bit of an image, speaking of foot length, we often think of a dog's foot is just where the pads and toes are. In this hind area, what we have is the extension of where the actual heel is. And that's what we're noticing all the way out to here to the toes. So this is like the heel, akin to our heel also, all the way. So that length showing up in there and there. Sophie and I were talking about all of the twigs from the spruce and the spruce and the fir that were on the snow top. And we were discussing whether they were blown off of the trees from the wind, or whether we could see sign of animals nipping them off of the treetops to drop them to the ground, which we could call nip twigs, which is a characteristic of quite a few animals, and especially red squirrels, and squirrels will do that. So they'll nip the ends of the branches so that they could actually get to the pine cones at the very end, or the buds at the very end of the branches that wouldn't support their body weight to begin with. Also, porcupine do that to some measure as well. Of course, it's a little different. But we were just like asking so many questions, noticing all sorts of feeding sign on these little spruce, branches, and just having a good time following our curiosity, which is really what tracking is, like asking all those questions, like, what if this, what if that? And then taking our knowledge that we've learned and trying to apply it, and oftentimes finding the places where we don't really have an answer, which is a really fun place to explore. Yeah, so, we're using like a combination of bits of knowledge that we've acquired over time, like looking at, like Sophie was talking about, the gate was a walking gate, and then looking at the overall size of those steps are starting to point us towards something, and ruling out other things as well. Gosh, I was moving between, I can't remember, Slide Mountain maybe, in the Adirondacks. Moving on the ridgeline with a friend, and he was like 15 minutes ahead of me.
Wait!
Try and get me! Try and get me!
This is not good snowball stuff.
Oh, you got me, Alicia. Leg.
You're like, tell me more.
You weren't interested in my story.
You like caught it, but the momentum actually knocked you.
Thank you for joining us for another Vermont Master Naturalist hike, and thank you all for coming up to Wind Gap today.
Thank you.
It lived up to its name, both for its beauty and for the wind today. Well, we've seen some great sign of trees and animals and everything. So yeah, join us next time. We'll have another adventure. Woo!
Thanks, everybody.